Hey everybody. Standard webinar fare. We have to do the whole like everybody come on in. Let us know how you're doing. If we can hear you in the chat as y'all come and join us for this fantastic, amazing website migrations and replatforming webinar with myself and Mr. Zach Chahalis. How you doing today, Zach?
Doing good. How you doing, man?
I'm doing really well. My daughter's asleep in the other room, so if I don't get like super loud, that's the reason why. And then my dog is not currently in the. This is like remote life, you know. It's like the dog at any point can start, scratching at the door. How about your pup?
He is currently licking the sofa armrest. So, there's that.
welcome, everybody. We'll do another minute or so. Zach, you got some fans in the chat. We got Mr. Clinton Dugan is here. How you doing, Clinton?
Hey, buddy. No, it is not. I wish it was, but during business hours, we stick with Zevia.
Gotcha. For those who are watching this on replay, Clinton wanted to know if Zach was having a bourbon, and he is sobriety by the book right now for this webinar. I can't speak to what he's going to do after.
Well, I want to give a shout out to Clinton because Clinton is part of the ownership group for a bourbon company here in Atlanta called Short Barrel. And he and I used to work together. It's fantastic bourbon. Highly recommend checking it out. So excited that he's here.
Awesome. Well, welcome, Clinton, and thank you for everyone who is joining us. Let's dive in because, as always, when Zach and I get together to do these webinars, we have a lot of things to say. Zach has so many stories, and it's very easy to go on tangents, but there's so much good information, and website migrations and replatforms are really important, especially if you have one coming up. It's so not rare, but more often than not, SEOs are not included in the conversation. And we're going to talk about, the ins and outs, the pre, the post, everything you need to consider. One thing I will not promise is I will not promise that I'm not going to make references to AI and ChatGPT in this webinar. So I apologize in advance if you're sick and tired of that topic. It's going to poke its head. So, without further ado, Zach, thoughts?
I don't know, Clinton. Does it need to become a drinking game every time AI comes up? Maybe.
That would be. Well, I'm not going to be responsible for anyone. Okay, let's dive in. So on the agenda, just kind of a run through is like this before you even start anything when it comes to a migration, replatform, redesign. What's the pre-migration considerations? What are these benchmarking metrics that you should have set up? And we'll go through those. Site architecture, really big topic, really important. We're going to go through, the obvious considerations and then a lot of the subtle things that you need to think about. HTML tagging elements, then on-page elements, the pre and post-launch considerations, because one thing that you'll notice throughout this entire conversation is a lot of these migrations and replatforming has to do with your relationships as an SEO with your marketing team, with the developers. It's a lot of like preparation and being in that process and make sure your voice is heard. And then finally, just replatforming nuances, because we'll talk about the difference between a migration versus a replatforming redesign. So, but first, I can't help myself. I asked ChatGPT to write a website migration joke, and I asked Midjourney to design an image based on the prompt from ChatGPT. So I apologize in advance, but what can I say? We're hilarious. Why did the SEO cross the road during a website migration? Anybody? Anybody in the chat? Anybody? To get to the other platform. And I promise you, 100%, never ever would lie to you. That is the last AI ChatGPT joke that I will tell in this whole webinar. There's no way that I won't tell 2 or 3 more. Okay. Pre-migrations preparations. Mr. Zach.
Yeah, so the thing I want to call out here is a failed replatforming can be really expensive, but it's kind of one of those things where you don't always realize it right away. oftentimes what happens is it takes Google some time to process all the changes, everything that might have gone on. But when you miss key parts of a replatforming, migration, redesign from SEO standpoint, you'll start to see something that looks like this, where those rankings just start to drop, but then they'll keep dropping and eventually they'll level out. But it can take time for that process to actually present itself, but then take even longer for you to recover from it. So that's why it's extremely important that SEOs are involved from the beginning of the conversation.
That's and one thing I do want to call out here too is Zach, as mentioned in the description of this webinar, Zach's done a ton of these migrations. How many have you done in total over the last few years?
In the course of my career, it's got to be at least 50 of different forms of redesigns, replatformings, migrations, sometimes with the same client repeatedly, multiple times, as they change and update their infrastructure. But it's been a lot of them.
And to that point, to our next slide, none of them are ever the same, correct?
Correct. Yeah. And I think that's the entire point of this slide is it entirely depends, right? So there are a lot of components that go into any one of these projects that need to be thought about in order for how to basically make it successful. So, what industry you're in can entirely lead to what platform that you're going to look at or what metrics that you look at or how you look at something. Even things like what technical debt that you currently have, maybe things that you need to resolve or address as a part of some of these conversations. What your business model is it B2B, B2C, or you an e-commerce site, or you lead generation? And then honestly, the depth of your site, how many templates do you have? How many components are in your component library? What's in your arsenal to help build your site today, or what do you need to create for your next site to be successful?
It's like overwhelming in the sense of that a migration or replatforming, like, yes, there is this checklist you can go through, but you also really need to know your specialty. Like, as you call out in terms like the industries, like an e-commerce site, or even like versus like a media publisher versus an international site. There's a ton of nuances for each of these industries as an SEO that you need to know from a technical standpoint.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's the thing. Like, if you look at e-com site, for example, now suddenly you're introducing a lot of templates, a lot of product SKUs. More than likely, you're introducing some form of faceted navigation and parameters that may come into play, where you may not have that as much with possibly a lead generation site. Not to say you won't, but it may be less likely. But then if you're doing an international site, it's, hey, how do we account for all these different languages or country variations that we need to have, and how do we tie them together? So it really depends on what your business is and what you're trying to accomplish. But that's the thing. That's kind of the fun part about doing these projects is they're all different. They rely on a lot of the same principles, but you never end up dealing with a replatforming or a migration that's the same as the last one.
And one call out with all this too is it can feel overwhelming. And so if you find yourself in like a place where you don't know what you don't know, or there's a technical limitation, it is appropriate to get a consultant, to get an agency involved. Like, it's just worth saying because so much can go wrong and the stakes are so high, as mentioned in the previous slide. So start from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is you really want your SEO folks involved in the beginning of this process. The number of times I've had someone come to me and go, oh, we'll bring you in, a couple of weeks before we go live with launch. Okay, I mean, you can do that, but the problem is at that point, you may have already sunk yourself so deep in the problems that it can either be very expensive or very time consuming to resolve those things. Whereas if you bring your SEO in from the beginning, they can help advise you along the way, catch problems before they become things that you have to go back and do a second or third time. And we can also help with things like identifying what platforms to look at or the things that you need to keep in mind for your particular business as you move forward through this process. And I mean, that's the whole thing is you want to make sure that if you have organic performance, if you have visibility, if you have a lot of your revenue and traffic coming in from the organic channel, you don't want to lose that during this process. But if right now you're in a position where, hey, we're not doing great on organic, but we're about to redesign our site, that's an area of opportunity where you can come in and set that proper foundation to begin with. So that way you can help them grow and move forward in it. Because I mean, that's the thing is like, there's only room to go up in those types of situations. However, you need that proper foundation to do it.
And one thing I will say is that if you are a marketer watching this, get your SEO involved. And if you're an SEO, be proactive. Let your CMO, let your head of marketing know that if decisions are made at the C-suite level, which sometimes they can be made and you can just be the last one to know, be proactive and let your team know that you should be involved, because to Zach's point, if you have a lot of revenue that's depending on organic traffic, you don't want that to really, be hurt so far down the line when it's too late.
And even if you're a in-house SEO or marketer, that's the thing too, is making your team aware of the considerations that may need to come in play. Because the number of times I've heard about, hey, I just got brought into this project last week where 90% of the long, what do we do? Okay, I mean, I wish we would have known about it sooner, but what can we do? We have to go fix that now. But if we start to kind of plant those seeds earlier on with our team and say, hey, if you hear these words, or if you start to talk about something like this, have a conversation with me, or let's have a conversation with our SEO agency and figure out how we go forward. The other piece I'll call it too is it's very valuable for your SEO to be involved throughout that whole process, including things like wireframe and design review. So this is one of the biggest things I get hung up on when people bring an SEO in at the last minute. Hey, we made these design changes. This is how our pages are going to look now. But they didn't factor in things like text being part of an image, so none of that text is crawlable, or the implications that might have on site speed, or they're improperly using heading tags. Those are big areas of opportunity. And when you get brought in too late in that process, you have to then go back and fix those things. There's obviously a cost involved with that, let alone the time implications of it. So if you're involved in the beginning and you can kind of get eyes on those designs, you can give feedback, or you can build out those design considerations that your developers need to factor in to make sure that's successful, and you don't have to do this twice.
And no one's saying this is easy, because we know, like, the bigger the organization, the more people are involved. And so the more people that you need to communicate with, because every department or every part of this process has a different SOP that they go through, where SEOs kind of need to insert themselves, especially if you're not an SEO first type of organization.
100%. Yeah, and that's the thing too, is the SEO can also help to guide that development process. So we can help create stories for your development team to act against, as well as participate in things like QA and user acceptance testing to make sure that things are functioning correctly. Some of the most successful migrations I've been a part of is where we were able to be involved from the kickoff of the project all the way through the end. And we start to work through, hey, within these sprints, we're going to create these page templates. Cool. Let's go create the requirements for those templates, or let's go create those technical foundational things that we need to consider, work them into those dev sprints, and then be involved in the user acceptance testing to make sure that they're functional now before you hit that code freeze period where nothing can be fixed.
And to that point, I'll include in the email follow-up here, but there's a great article recently by Holly Miller Anderson all about how to write these great stories, these great tickets for your dev team, because it takes a certain type of communication style to clearly communicate without over-communicating each iteration of what you need through this process.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is a technical-minded SEO can help have those conversations with developers, whether it is being a part of a sprint planning call or developing those user stories and knowing how to write a story for a development team. So with that, the other thing I want to call out too is always have benchmarks, always create reporting that will help you measure, hey, is this project a success? So you want to know what KPIs are important to you and your business, but things that typically stand out to me are like, hey, let's look at visibility. As much as rankings are always kind of a comical aspect of SEO, and whether you like them or you hate them, it's certainly something you want to keep an eye on. Is, hey, our keyword rankings going up and down. But as a data-centric person, to me, I very much care about the business metrics that are tied into a project. So if I'm an e-com site, for example, I care about things like traffic and engagement metrics. I care about conversions or transactions. I care about the revenue that's coming in from that channel, because I want to know, hey, we made this change to it. Is it successful, or do we have a potential problem? And the more that you can benchmark that and compare back to an equivalent period, the more you can understand, hey, something's off the rails. We need to drill a little bit deeper into this, or we can start to gauge the success of a project.
Right. And that's why the planning matters, like, ahead of time, having all that set in stone, so you don't get after the fact and you're like, well, I have no idea whether this was actually better or worse for specific money pages on your site, let alone the entire rankings.
Yeah. So the big call out here is There are different types of website projects. And in some cases, you might be doing all of the above. I have certainly worked with clients in the past where they were doing a redesign, changing every possible template, how it looked, how it felt. They were replatforming to a new platform or an upgraded version of what they used to have. And they may be migrated, whether it's from content from a subdomain going to a different subdomain or to a completely entirely new domain. All these things can occur at the same time. But I think let's jump into the next one. I did want to break these out a little bit to kind of maybe talk about what these kind of mean in the back end and maybe help you identify, hey, maybe what are some considerations we need to look at. So a redesign, let's say you're just doing a redesign. In most cases, this is you redesigning a page template. So of course you want to be involved on looking at those designs and wireframes, making sure that they're crawlable, search engine friendly, the content's still there, and really that nothing broke during the process. But oftentimes during a redesign, you normally don't see URL changes because you want to kind of maintain it, but maybe just make the design more modern or more appealing to your customer. You're making feedback changes based on UX testing as part of that process. Yeah. But then you get the idea of a replatforming. So replatforming is looking more at changing from one platform to another. And that could be going from like Sitecore 7 to Sitecore 10, or going to a completely different platform, like going from a WordPress to a Drupal. In those cases, it's possible that URLs might change. Most platforms will allow you to have some flexibility in the URL structures that you choose, but in some cases, you may get some pushback from development, or for business reasons, you may want to change the URLs. So very often in replatforming cases, there may be some evolution of the URLs that happen there. And you want to make sure that you're bringing along that legacy authority with you. So we'll touch on some tactics to do that a little bit later on. But when those URLs change, that is the biggest thing that will cause your loss of visibility and performance in SEO, is not doing those redirects properly. And then as always with the design piece too, you still want to make sure that they're crawlable and search engine friendly. But with a replatforming, I want to call out technical debt. Like this is a big component, especially with large sites that have maybe a lot of issues that have built up over time, or many layers of problems that have been layered on over the years. A replatforming is a good way to clear up some of that technical debt and maybe address some of those SEO problems that have been called out in the past that you couldn't address due to a platform limitation, for example. So now's the time to address those things, and you really want to make sure that that's built into the time allocation to do it properly the first time so it doesn't inherit that debt on the new site. The last piece I kind of call is a migration. So a migration can kind of vary in a couple different ways. It could be something as, I don't want to say small, but the idea of changing a host, changing a CDN. In those cases, you kind of want to make sure, hey, maybe nothing broke, but in theory, the site shouldn't be changing. But a migration could also be, hey, I am changing my domain from A to B. That's an entirely different complex process, because now not only do you have to get all of the authority taken away from the old domain and bring it to the new one, but you may be factoring other components as well. It can be a very complicated project to do, but that's where hopefully having your SEO involved can limit the implications of that and result in a quick drop off from the old site, but a quick increase on the new site that hopefully outperforms what the old one was doing.
That's a goal a lot of times. I remember when you have the whole conversation around moving a blog from a subdomain to a subfolder, and obviously that's a scary process for a lot of folks, but the goal is that you're going to see more traffic, because that debate's been settled at this point, right?
Yeah, and I've also worked with a wide variety of brands over the years where maybe they did a rebranding exercise, or hey, I was able to acquire this domain, I'd rather use this instead. Okay, let's work through that implication. But those are the types of things that come up in these cases where you need that SEO involved before you, for lack of better words, shoot your foot off.
Yep.
This has been a topic of conversation for a long time, obviously, but I always want to bring it back up. Make sure you understand your approach to desktop and mobile design. Understand where your traffic's coming from, what devices that they're using. But you should ideally be starting with a mobile-first design and effectively scaling up those designs to work for your site. So you want to provide that best possible experience, but it might depend on your site. I've seen sites where, hey, we tend to get more desktop users, but Google may still be focusing on your mobile site for indexation and crawling purposes. So you want to make sure that you're providing that best experience all around for everyone. So always start with mobile first and try and look at scaling up. The other piece is determine how you want to approach mobile. So there's different approaches to sites, and there's even kind of more than these, but I kind of want to summarize in these main 3 points. Responsive design is what we see mostly these days. It's essentially a site that gets scaled depending on the viewport, but it's typically the same URL. And this is normally the route that folks go these days. You still see some forms of adaptive design, though. So adaptive design may use the same URL between desktop and mobile, but they're essentially separate code bases between the desktop and mobile sites. You may have multiple versions of this. That might help with things like site speed performance, but it may also make things more complicated by the number of websites and code bases that you then have to manage. So there's kind of pluses and minuses to these. And then separate mobile site, I kind of hope that folks still aren't doing these things, but I still see them in the wild. Separate mobile sites like an M.dot site or mobile dot, it can work, but just know that you introduce so much more complexity that you have to account for with these, because you have to do things like desktop to mobile relationships, alternate tags, canonical tags, things like that. And just because I see the comment come out in chat, and hi Jeff, because I know that I'm not surprised you brought that up. Hey, so the idea of AMP as well, AMP is certainly a factor here. If you have AMP pages, and I'm going to touch on that whole concept entirely, but if you have AMP pages, that's also another aspect of complexity, more code bases, more alternate tags, canonical relationships that need to occur. At the same time, Google's basically sunset AMP. So we still see it being used in a wide variety of cases, but typically, for the most part, I'm recommending folks sunset AMP unless they really just want to keep it for some particular reason and can manage the complexity appropriately. But Google's essentially sunsetting it. GA4 right now has no way of really handling the reporting around AMP. That's actually something they just basically came out with a couple of days ago. It's like, hey, we don't have it. So AMP just introduces a lot of extra complexity into the thing. And at this point, I don't recommend that folks do it.
I was going to say, not to start a whole controversy, but is there, in your opinion, anything beneficial of having AMP these days? Like, is the speed even worth it? User experience?
No. No, just honestly, no. There are ways that you can build a fast, friendly version of a site without having to create an AMP version of it. So honestly, I would rather a developer focus on making that experience functional, leveraging all the modern technologies that are available to build a page effectively. But no, I wouldn't recommend AMP really in any current situation in 2023.
Okay, let's talk benchmarking metrics.
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to this earlier, but you want to set that baseline. You want to understand, hey, maybe what's a point of failure, point of success. You want to understand maybe what is a threshold for, all right, we have a problem we need to look into. So I've worked with clients in the past who are like, all right, we understand that there's going to be a fluctuation period. We've set that proper expectation. However, what is our floor and ceiling to say, oh, this is a success, or, oh, we have a big problem to deal with? So you want to understand what that baseline is, and you want to kind of understand what's happening with those numbers as you progress through the process, just to make sure that you're not, going down the wrong path or something.
Site architecture. And at this point, I do apologize in advance, but I have another fantastic ChatGPT joke for those of you who just joined us. I asked ChatGPT to share some website migration jokes with me, and they did. It came through. Why did the SEO feel like an architect during a website migration, Zach? This one's really bad.
Oh, boy.
Because they were building a structure that would support their rankings for years to come. Over to you, buddy.
Wow. All right. All right. So the big thing I'll call on the technical architecture side, choosing your framework or your CMS is very vital to this entire process. You need to work with your team to understand, hey, what is the, let's say, CMS that's going to best suit our needs as a business, how we go to market, how our customers talk to us, how we sell things. But you want to make sure that your SEO is involved in that process as well, because if you're choosing between multiple different CMS systems, and as they've all gotten better, I'll give it that caveat, there are still some platforms that have SEO issues or things that might need to be addressed or factors that you might want to take into account during that selection process before it becomes too late, before you spend, let's say, 6 to 10 plus figures on a platform and then realize, oh, this is actually not going to work for what we need. There's that element of having that SEO in the room from the beginning to help determine whether you're going to have an issue or not.
To that point, is there any way, in your opinion, to future-proof your CMS decision? Like, do you have any sort of thoughts on what you look for? Obviously, it's another it depends situation because everyone has different
Yes.
needs, but yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think it depends on what you guys do. I've seen sites recently that stick with a platform for a long period of time. And especially if you're a site, like I've worked with e-com sites, we're like, oh, we've been on the site for 10 years and we're going to replatform and keep the next one for another 10 years. So you want something that's still being actively enhanced and developed that doesn't necessarily rely on you having to spend a ton of money or re-architect the entire site every time you want to make an upgrade. You also want to make sure that your platform really is capable of doing the things that you want to do now. So let's say you're locked into it, you can't change something for a period of time. You want to make sure they can do what you need now and can't just say, oh, well, I think they'll address this in the next 6 months. They may not. They may forget about it. They may devalue it. You want to make sure that you're choosing what you can do now. But I think with the way that web development has changed over the years, I think there's a little bit less permanence that exists when it comes to websites these days.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, that's the case. One last question here is, there's been those statistics out there that a lot of at least smaller websites tend to redesign, migrate, do all these things every like 2 to 3 years. Do you have any recommendation for, like, regardless of size, like how often a business should consider it?
That entirely depends on the business itself.
Yeah,
Honestly, as long as it's doing what you needed to do, then I think you're in a good spot. And you don't necessarily need to push to do that. However, it's when you start to run into that increasing tech debt that we were talking about, or the inability to get something done within the platform that you're talking about. That's when you kind of want to start working through that process. But I've also been a part of these replatforming migration type projects where they take 2 years to do. So it entirely depends on your business, how slow you are to move, the cost of doing something. I mean, I've seen Salesforce Commerce Cloud implementations that are $30+ million to implement. Like, that's a lot of money to dedicate to something. So you want to kind of factor all these into your decision. But that's also going to lead to, hey, how long am I sticking on this platform potentially before I look at another one? For lack of better words, RTFM. Read the blank manual. Yeah. So in a lot of cases, I've worked with developers where it goes, oh, we can't do this. We don't know how to do this. And in some cases, folks just don't always read the documentation. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes there may be actual problems, but sometimes it may be, hey, I don't know how to set up a redirect in this platform. As a built-in function to do it, I don't know how to do it. Typically, there's documentation that will tell you, hey, here's the syntax we use, or it's just basic regex, or here's what you need to do to get something done. I mentioned it before, but Salesforce Commerce Cloud, they have extensive documentation that tells you really most of what you need to know about the platform. Is it perfect? No, but it will give you a good direction of where to go. But those are the types of things that you can learn quite quickly without having to rely on someone else to do it for you. Then there's also the idea of out of the box versus custom. So I mentioned before, a lot of platforms maybe aren't perfect for SEO out of the box. Many years ago, Sitecore had a lot of issues, for example, where like it couldn't do, and this should date this analogy a little bit, couldn't do pagination out of the box. Rel equals next and prod, no idea, couldn't figure out how to do it. So more often than not, you had to work with a developer to build a custom element that can handle that approach for you. A lot of platforms have gotten better. I mean, right now, Sitecore is a pretty solid platform for SEO purposes. More so on the lead generation side. I haven't played with it as much on e-commerce lately, but it can do it. But these platforms tend to get better and better and better. So you have to keep in mind, what are things that I can do out of the box, or what are things I have to custom code to address something? Another perfect example is Salesforce Commerce Cloud. I keep going back to that. But while it's great in many areas, it does have some fallbacks or some issues in other areas. One example being, on most page templates, the canonical tags are not allowed to retain any parameters. So if you want your parameters to be indexed for some reason, you have to custom override that ability and build that functionality out. Not all page templates within SFCC, but some. So that's certainly something you just want to account for is, hey, what do I need to get a developer in here to build or supplement for me to do this properly?
And also, I'd imagine the risk with custom is that you're almost going to accelerate that tech debt, because I think it's when you custom build modules, that's where you can run into long-term unanticipated issues.
Yeah, correct. When you start to modify the core, like you get to the point where, oh, maybe only one person can edit this for me, or I have to pay someone a lot of money to figure out what was done, especially if the code's not clean, and there's a whole lot of other factors in there too. But the more that you kind of tweak it out of the box, the more it potentially will hurt you down the line.
So get that right the first time.
Yeah. So typically during any form of migration, replatforming, etc., I try to recommend to folks to keep the information architecture, how your site is organized, ideally the same. And the reason you want to do this is the more minimal changes that you have, let's say keeping URL structures the same between old and new, the more Google's going to readily understand the changes that you made, and you won't necessarily see that long, dragged out replatforming fluctuation period that occurs in the data on the back end. So the more things that you can kind of keep the same, like then you don't have to worry about Google processing a redirect or anything like that. With that said, though, a replatforming is often a time to correct things that may be wrong with your site. So, for example, I still see sites today where their entire URL structure is based on just IDs, category IDs, product IDs, things like that, where they're not user-friendly URLs. And let's say it's a site that's been around for 10, 15 plus years. This is kind of when you want to come in and go, all right, let's organize this site how we want to properly, but maybe look at how we can retain things like maybe some of those product IDs to allow for proper redirect logic to occur. But you really want to kind of clean up some of those aspects of your IA that may have been a problem before. But that's really a conversation you want to have with your business team. Just know when you make these big changes like this, it can lengthen the fluctuation time that occurs when you start to look at, all right, how long am I going to lose my rankings, or how long is it going to take for Google to understand this change? The more change that you make, the more time it's going to take for search engines to process this. They're smart systems, but they're still a little slow to process some of those types of things.
And we'll come up with some tricks that you can do to get a little bit faster.
A little bit, yeah. So, and that's the kind of main point. When you make those major changes in IA, that's when you really start to see the fluctuation. Google retains the legacy URL. They keep going to it. They kind of go, oh, I now see that this is a 301 redirect. Let me give it a couple more days, come back, make sure it's still a 301 redirect, and then maybe I'll migrate everything over. They're a little bit slow to do that. They're a little bit mistrusting of folks. So they want to make sure that they get it right. But that's where you can kind of be the negative beneficiary of doing it, because you're the one losing the visibility.
And from your experience, obviously another it depends situation, but what in setting those expectations of the fluctuations to your C-suite, what's the range of the time it would take Google to really kind of settle in where it's going to rank you on the new version of your site?
So in examples I've worked with clients in the past where it was just a redesign and they were just changing page templates, URL stayed the same. That could be a couple of days to a week, maybe a couple of weeks. When I've worked with major e-commerce sites in the past where they completely went to a different platform, re-architected, changed their entire IA, changed every URL structure possible, I mean, you could be talking weeks, if not months. And sometimes I like to just tell a client, you might see something for 3 to 6 months. However, the more that you listen to your SEO and the more that you follow the recommendations that we're providing, you can tend to shorten that period down. It's not that we're giving you recommendations for the sake of giving you recommendations. If we're giving you a recommendation, it's typically because, hey, this is what needs to happen to make this work in the best possible case. But your SEO can also work with you to kind of figure out alternative solutions when something's not possible to do, or just for time considerations, we can't do it. Okay, let's find that alternate solution that we can do. And yeah, maybe it's 90% of what you want it to be, but that's just something you kind of need to keep in mind in the back of your head going, all right, we couldn't get this perfect. It may take a little bit longer for Google to understand it because of this reason.
And obviously there's never a perfect time to do this, but I just hope for everyone's sake, there's always that risk of a major algorithm update, especially if you did anything in the past year with all of these new systems rolling out, can get really complicated too.
And also keep in mind your peak seasonality for your business. I've had e-com sites in the past kind of come to me, hey, we're going to launch in November. Like, I wouldn't, because keep in mind, like, let's say you launch November 1st, your peak, fluctuation period is right around Black Friday and going into the holidays. Do you really want to risk that? So that's kind of where you can have those conversations and use data to your advantage to kind of set that expectation.
I love that.
So this is the big thing I want to call out is when you change those URLs, I know for the SEOs on the call, this shouldn't be a surprise, but those redirects are vital to your success. You want to make sure that you're 301 redirecting those old URLs to your new ones. This will tell Google, hey, this old URL doesn't exist anymore. Essentially flush this from your index. Its new home is here. Migrate over the authority to this new URL. And when this is done effectively and cleanly, Google can understand and process it pretty quickly. And I've sometimes seen them make a change to, a site replatforming launch within a day in terms of the URLs changing over. That's kind of what you want to see. Now, the big call I want to make here is there is a place and space to use 302 redirects. However, for the most part, you really don't want to. A 302 redirect will typically not result in the old URL getting removed from the index, and B, it will not pass along the authority to the new URL. So this is purely just for user experience purposes. And just in the long run, it's going to hurt you because essentially those new pages that you created are kind of just starting from scratch. They've never existed before to Google and they have no prior authority. And you left that all back in your old house. So it's just kind of a missed opportunity. But again, there may be a need for 302s. Hey, this page is going to be a phase 2 thing. It's not going to come for a month after launch. You might want a 302 redirect so you have to unwind something later. But for the most part, you want to try and avoid those where possible.
Makes sense.
So, and I try playing a little bit with Midjourney here myself, so I'll kind of give a little bit of context. I think I like cheesy analogies when it comes to SEO, and I like to equate SEO to a house within a neighborhood. Your technical foundation, the framework that it's built on, is that foundation of your house. It needs to be solid in order for that house to stand. Your content, your on-site, everything that your user sees or that you see when you go to the site is the actual house itself. And the neighborhood that you live in is kind of like your authority and your off-site aspect of things. So your backlinks, your social media profiles, everything's kind of factored into that. So kind of the thing I want to call out here is whenever you do a replatform and you change URL structures, make sure you update your legacy redirects as well. So let's say you've gone through 5 replatformings in the last decade, and every time you've done it, you've done a new URL structure. You want to go back and update those legacy redirect rules that are in place to point directly to your new URL. You don't want them to keep hopping to one another. So again, I'll continue with my cheesy analogies here. If you have multiple chain redirects from all of your old sites that just keep going through one another, it's like you move 4 times in real life. Every time you do it, you do a change of address with the postal service, but you're still sending all of your mail to your first house and praying it shows up at the most recent one. So you really want to make sure you update those redirects to be a single hop. And also a lot of search engines still struggle with following redirect hops as well. So they may give up after a certain number of hops, and that's what you don't want. So this picture here, tying back to my house analogy, you don't want to let that legacy authority rot because it's how you build up those new pages so you're not starting from scratch.
And Rich calls out that most people don't even realize how many URL variants there are to control for.
100%, yeah. So the other piece I'll call out here is error handling. If you have error handling issues with your site, a replatforming or redesign, it's a good time to kind of address some of those things and make sure that you're providing the proper status code in those situations. So just high level, if a page is meant to resolve, it should return a 200 OK status code. If it's not meant to resolve, typically it's a 404. The caveat to that being, if a page used to exist, it was a low quality page or was junk, wasn't worth redirecting, but it's gone away, make that a 410 gone. If that page will never come back, a 410 gone will get it out of the index quicker. There have been multiple studies that have shown that. But it also just tells Google, hey, this isn't coming back. Hey, you don't need to focus on this page. And it can also help reduce crawl budget waste that's maybe going in that direction too. You want to avoid returning 500 status codes on your site. So server errors to Google kind of indicate, hey, this site's not stable. We have a problem. And they may lose trust in the rest of the site as a result of it. The biggest example of this is never return a 500 status code on your robots.txt file. Google will essentially de-index the site, and basically, it's broken. We don't know what to do. So absolutely something you want to avoid. The exception to the rule here is you should use a 503 service unavailable code if your site goes down for maintenance, any sort of thing where the site's just not online. That just tells Google, hey, we're down, we're coming back. Don't de-index us. Don't take any rash decision here, but come back in a little bit and the site will be back. Big thing I'll call out too is avoid soft 404s. Google's very, very much looking at soft 404s. They're heavily reported within Google Search Console, but this is essentially a case where you return a 200 OK, but the page is actually an error copy. A good example of this being a product list result on an e-commerce site that has no products. So, hey, no products found here. Google's going to look at this going, why do we want to index it? It's basically a poor user experience for our customers.
Yeah.
Cool. So HTML tagging elements. Canonical tags are extremely valuable. If you're not familiar with a canonical tag, it basically tells Google, hey, this is our preferred version of a URL. Index this. If there's duplicates, consolidate them into this version of the URL. So where possible, you want to make sure that your canonical tags are built to focus on the pages that are core and priority to your site. A big example are e-com sites that rely heavily on faceted navigation, where you may not want things like certain product filters to be indexed, or in the case of, and I hate to harp on Salesforce Commerce Cloud, but SFCC does have a ton of built-in parameters. And if you go to an SFCC site, you'll see dozens of them as you kind of go through that experience. But in this case, you want to kind of make sure that those parameters that you don't want are getting stripped off in those canonical tags. So the example shown on the right is, hey, I'm using this PD show equals true parameter to indicate something to my users. Maybe it changes the way the content's shown on the page. But I don't want Google to waste time looking at this alternate page, let alone index it and have it compete against my main version of the page. So that canonical tag will tell Google to ignore it and instead canonicalize that authority that it may have built up back to that original version of the page. This is also extremely valuable if you're using things like UTM tracking parameters, for example. And then include alternate tags where needed. So we kind of mentioned the idea of international SEO before, but if you have different languages or countries that you have different sites for, you want to indicate those things to Google. So in this particular example on the side here, we have an American site in English and we have a Spanish site from Spain. And in those cases, you want to tell Google, hey, these are complements to one another. Don't treat them as duplicates. Don't treat them as pages that are meant to be competing against one another, but rather treat them as the same page, consolidate that authority. But if I'm a Spanish-speaking user, serve me this page instead. So it helps Google understand that. And then there are other alternate tags that can be used for things like separate mobile sites or AMP, and then some other instances as well.
AMP.
All right. So any form of replatform or redesign is kind of a good case to revisit the core fundamentals of SEO. Page metadata, for example, being a big thing. This is where you can revisit those title tags and meta descriptions that you have in place, potentially A/B testing these things, finding things that might perform better. For those that are not fully aware, title tags are a factor when it comes to rankings, and those are things that you can optimize and possibly help in that sense. Meta descriptions are not, but they are a factor when it comes to things like click-through rate, because it's that description that shows up in search results. So if you can optimize this, get a good call to action, kind of find ways to draw people into the page, you can A/B test and improve those meta descriptions and find those things that help to bring more of those customers in.
Especially if you're on one of those SERPs where it's like everyone has the exact same title because that's like what's ranking, but the meta description is what gets them, other than brand recognition.
Yeah, or rich snippets. Yeah. All right, so I know I've kind of harped on this a little bit, but you want your SEO folks involved in that design process and figuring out how those pages look. The biggest issue here is just preventing crawlability issues. There's nothing more disheartening than having to go back to a client and say, hey, all of that content you put on this page is lovely, but Google's not going to see any of it because it's part of an image. So you want to try and prevent those things before they become a problem and make sure things are hard-coded text, for example. Structured data is also a big area of opportunity in any form of replatforming or redesign. So those that know me know I'm kind of obsessed with structured data, and I think I did an entire Rankable episode with Garrett on it. But structured data is, and I'll stick with my cheesy analogy, it's that way of taking a Shakespearean novel and distilling it to a kindergarten reading level for Google. It helps them understand complex topics in a simple way. So this is a great area of opportunity to enhance that structured data that exists on your site. Use organization or corporation schema to talk about your business, your brand, what it is you do, what you sell. Use those breadcrumb or web page schema to mark up your site structure, FAQs to mark up any frequently asked questions you get on your site that may help to populate people also ask questions. Person schema, article schema, image and video markup. There's infinite different types of structured data, and you want to pick the ones that are valuable to your business. For example, an e-commerce site will want to use product structured data and fill out as much of the information as possible. So just to call out on the side, this is an example of organization schema from schema.org. Now, to me, this is very bare and very basic. I would recommend building out something that talks as much as possible about the business. And also just, if you have a fax number, I'm kind of curious what year it is. But yeah, you want to build out that structured data. That's where having that SEO get involved can help to support that and build out that information, either a static script or a template that they can work with your developer to implement across page templates.
And this is also another place to pay attention to updates from Google, because what like schema that they are structured data they're paying attention to. And actually, when you mentioned like e-commerce, like just focusing on pros and cons recently, and obviously they've been doing reviews for a while, but there's a ton out there at any given moment they could start, pulling it in to give you that visibility enhancement, but that'll differentiate you.
And you'll want to make sure that you keep up with the changes too, even after you go live. I used to work with a hotel chain back in the day where they had a certain way of marking up images that was perfectly fine. And then one day Google changed the requirement. Rather than using photo, they wanted to use image, and then all of our structured data failed. So that was kind of one of those things where you want to keep up with those changes and make sure that you account for them as quickly as you possibly can. Yeah. So pre-launch considerations here. The big thing I want to call out is build a checklist and make sure you're continuing to add to this and testing things as you go through the entire process. So your go live checklist is really kind of your source of what should I be looking at when this site is going live to make sure that things are functioning as expected. So that's where you run through your redirect map, testing all those SEO stories that you helped build back in many slides ago. Any of your on-page recommendations, your schema, your robust.txt, your site maps. You want to test all these things as you go live. And essentially, if you identify an area of opportunity or an issue, you want to make sure that those are addressed quickly. Be ready to have something like a rollback plan. If something like your robust.txt file blocks the entire site, you can't edit that quick enough. High priority items, you want to address those within ideally a couple hours, if not a couple days. But also be fair to your development teams and your marketing teams. If there are minor things that are not going to hurt you or not going to take a step back, consider bringing those over as things that get addressed in the future or the next phase of development or an upcoming sprint. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill where you don't need to, because then you're going to lose that trust from your developer. I also really recommend that SEO teams be involved in QA, UAT, and go, no-go conversations with clients. I can't tell you, I've lost count of the number of times I've been on go, no-go calls and they're asking, oh, we think the entire site's ready to go live. We're going to go live at 9 a.m. tomorrow. And the SEO sitting there going, you guys know half these pages don't work, right? You want to make sure that you can be that voice in the room to tell them if there's going to be a potential problem. You also want to make sure this is a case where if you're an agency side person, you can make your client look really good because they can essentially save the day by helping to identify and block a concern before it goes out.
Huge.
There we go. I know I kind of mentioned it before, but you want to build out those KPIs and how you're measuring success. But these days, it's not hard to create a simple automated dashboard that can measure a lot of these KPIs for you. So that could be a consideration. Hey, maybe you create something real quick in Looker Studio that you can use to compare the go live period to an equivalent period. But you want to kind of build these things out so that way you can easily monitor the success or the failure of that project. This is going to be the biggest one that I want to call out. Make sure you develop and test your sitemaps and your robust.txt file. So with your final robust.txt file, if you have a development site that, for example, may be publicly accessible for some reason prior to going live, you may want to block that site with your robust.txt file. It's pretty normal. You do want to make sure that that slash gets removed before that site pushes live. I worked with many sites over the years where that inadvertently gets pushed live by accident. And I've seen situations where Google picks up on it and it could take 6 months to a year to recover from something that's just one character of a mistake. So make sure you test those things. Make sure you have a plan to update that robots.txt file, and also identify any of those exclusions that you want to do before the site goes live. For example, if a page is already indexed, robots.txt files are not very efficient at getting old URLs removed as much as like a no index tag would be. However, if they're blocked to begin with, they can be very effective at keeping those things out of the index. So you want to kind of keep those things in mind as you go through that process and say, oh, we've got these duplicate Salesforce Commerce Cloud demandware.store URLs. We want to make sure we don't include those or any of these parameters that we maybe don't want. The other piece is sitemaps. I think a lot of SEOs forget how important that sitemaps are and how Google understands and processes a website. So sitemaps are incredibly important. You want to make sure that those sitemaps are built properly. It's your roadmap to your site for search engines to understand what's going on. You want to make sure these things are free and clear of errors, only contain URLs that resolve with a 200 OK or canonical or indexable. You want to avoid those errors, 300s, 400s, 500s, non-canonicals, non-indexable pages, because it sends mixed signals to Google. Hey, here's my roadmap of the site, but half these URLs don't work, so have fun, go crawling those pages. They're not going to trust that sitemap file. They're not going to come back and crawl it. And I've worked with an e-commerce site where, let's say they're getting 180 million crawls in a 3-month period from Google, and their sitemap was so full of errors that they only visited the sitemap 100 times in that same period. That's not even a fraction of the crawl rate. That's negligible. See, when you have those errors, Google won't trust those files. You want to make sure that they're clean and functional. But you can also use these things to slice and dice your site to say, hey, let's have a sitemap dedicated to our products, or have a sitemap dedicated to this section of content. That can help Google kind of understand when things are changing, but also help you as an SEO or a data person to say, all right, we have some indexation issues with these pages. You can look at something like a Google Search Console or Bing Webmaster Tools and see things like the indexation rates of those files and identify where you may have a problem. The last piece, and I'll touch on it deeper, dirty XML sitemaps are very valuable, especially if you're changing URLs on a site. But I'll go a little bit deeper into that a little bit later. So those post-launch considerations, that checklist that you built, now's the time to run it. You want to make sure you run it before it goes live, but you're going to want to run it again after it goes live. Things may break during those rollout processes. You want to make sure that didn't have a problem, but have that rollback plan. If they have those high priority items, you want to address those quickly and just keep an eye on those reporting dashboards that you built out during this process. Once you're comfortable that your site's in a good spot, you've run your checks, everything's good to go, this is where you can go and resubmit those XML sitemaps to Google and Bing and kind of give them that kick in the rear that makes them go back and recrawl those pages and understand what's going on with your site, especially if you have major changes to your site architecture. And then you want to monitor those sitemaps for errors that may come up in Search Console as well. They'll be very quick to tell you if your sitemap's formatted incorrectly. But then you want to keep an eye on those indexation rates within those sitemap files as well. So a couple of nuances and things that kind of stick out. And
I'm going to interrupt you with one last, I promise, awful ChatGPT joke. And thanks everyone for sticking with us. I think we're doing good on time. We'll have a little questions at the end. But why did the SEO feel like they were on a roller coaster during a website replatforming, Zach? Because their rankings kept going up and down. And thank you, Midjourney, for the wonderful weird image cartoon. Okay, continue, sir.
Yeah, okay. So the big thing I want to call out is consistency is key. This is where I see a lot of website replatformings go wrong. It's just things are not talking properly to one another. I'll give an example. All of your internal links contain a trailing slash. All of your canonical tags don't include a trailing slash. You've just changed your URLs. These are brand new to Google. They've never seen them before, and you're giving them mixed signals to begin with. Google's now left with the decision of, do we respect your internal linking or do we respect your canonical tags? They're going to have to flip a coin and pick one, and you're putting them in the bad position of having to do that, or they may just ignore them entirely and just do whatever they want or not index the site. So you want to look at those details of things. You want to make sure that there's consistency between the URLs that you mark up in those canonical tags, the URLs that you call in your internal links, your XML sitemaps, and your schema URL references. All of these should be pointing to the same places. If you're not, you can risk sending those mixed signals to Google that will cause those problems. If you happen to also do a migration to a new domain, subdomain, something like that, make sure you do a change of address with Google Search Console, Bing Webmaster Tools. Essentially, this kind of tells them, prompts them, hey, we changed. This site that used to be here is now here. It's exactly like you doing that change of address in real life when you move, but it tells those search engines, hey, we're over here now, and helps them process that change quicker. Because even though you do redirects and everything else perfectly, Google's still kind of going to go, wait, so this is over here now? And this is kind of that signal then of like, yes, this is intentionally what we're trying to do, and respect everything that we're telling you to do with things like redirect rules. And I mentioned it early on, you want to set those proper expectations with your clients, with your bosses. So I know Garrett asked a good question before of how long this takes. It can be very quick. So the kind of graphical example here is a site that actually changed domains entirely. And you can kind of keep an eye on things like the performance and go, oh, as I see things drop off over here, I'm seeing it increase over here. And this particular site did like a staged migration of things where they did certain sections of the site after points of time, which I don't recommend in most ideal situations. But in these cases, it's cool to be able to see, all right, we see the rankings dropping off over here, but we're seeing them pick back up over here. And not only did this get to the point where, hey, everything migrated over, but because this site actually listened to all the recommendations from the SEO, they actually began to outperform the site that they used to have. So it's kind of those cases of like, you'll have that little bit of fluctuation period, but in the long run, in 6 months, a year from now, you start to really see the benefit of everything that you did.
That's the dream.
Yep. All right. So dirty XML sitemaps. This is kind of, and I mean, this is not a trick unique to me. It's certainly something I've seen throughout the years, but it's a little bit of a trick that I like to use when I'm doing a URL change or a major replatforming shift for a site. Normally, and I was very strict on this before, but you want those sitemap files to be clean, right? This is kind of a different approach to it. This is taking all of your legacy URLs and putting them into a static XML sitemap file, dropping it at the root of your site. You don't want this referenced in things like your robots.txt file, your sitemap index files, things like that. But it can take all of those old URLs and you can submit that to Google, and it kind of forces them to recrawl all of those old pages quicker than if they were left to their own devices and understand those redirects and those changes that you did. And it can kind of speed up that process of Google understanding the change. So this is something where your SEO can come in and help support the build of this file, but it kind of gives them that little kick to get things going. So a good example, you have a blog, it has content that has been written going back to 2009. When you do that replatforming migration, if Google knows, hey, we haven't changed that content in the last 10 years, they're not going to come back and crawl that page very regularly. So the crawl rate of it is going to be very low. If you don't do something like this that kind of primes them to, hey, go back and look at this page, it might be weeks, if not months, before they come back and understand that redirect. And that's where you run into issues getting those old URLs flushed from the index and understanding that they've now moved over to a new location. So this is just one of those ways that you can help kind of prime Google and get them moving forward a little bit.
Dude, you whipped through so much good information. That was so rich. For those of you who are still with us, and thank you all for joining us today. Tomorrow we will send over the full deck, so you can get all of this information and kind of go through it piece by piece if you want. Build out your own checklist, which we'll send over as well. At this point, if there are any questions, we're happy to take them. I realize we are at time. So a couple of things I did want to call out as any of the questions that they do come in is IPL rank. Be remiss if I didn't call out, we are a digital marketing agency. We do technical SEO, content strategy, and website migrations. Have had a lot of success in the past where folks like Zach and Mike King and Michael Glavick all just bounce into these projects and really map out, cross all the T's, dot all the I's. I love how meticulous they are, and ultimately helping sites acquire and migrate without the traffic loss. I mean, it's can be a very difficult process the more complicated it is. And obviously, one of the great things about Zach and Mike and Michael is that you guys know how to talk to devs. Like, you know how to have that conversation to communicate what needs to happen that someone who's not as technical SEO might not.
Correct. Yep.
We've got a couple of goodies. Would love for you all to take a look and download some of the things in terms of making the compelling case for SEO during the recession. So if you are a marketer and you're doing a big migration, you're doing a big replatforming, and you're focusing on SEO, whether this recession is real or not, there's never been a better time to double down on your organic search. We do have a couple of questions coming in that we'd love to take real quick. I said AI. I apologize. I'm sorry, but I love this. It's so fascinating. And we put together a little guide all around AI and content and SEO, whether it's good, whether it's bad, risk, opportunities, you name it. Got a link to that free guide. And they're like 35 pages of all of our insights that we've done testing it and, kind of what the industries are handling it. I do a video show, comes out every Monday. Check out our YouTube, the SEO Weekly, and our Rankable podcast. Every week we have an episode interviewing all sorts of great SEOs and marketers across the industry. I am like super hyped. These come out on Wednesdays. Next Wednesday, we had a special where Michael King, our founder, actually interviewed the CEO of Neva, Sridhar Ramaswamy, talking all about, you guessed it, AI, how search engines are built. He's got a book coming out. Well, Mike's got a book coming out in August. So it's going to be, it was a great interview. I'm really excited for that to come out. My name is Garrett. This is Zach. Real quick, I got a little time, but Zach, do you want to take Rich's question? He'd love a couple of ideas on how to convey the urgency and importance of involving the SEO in the conversation early, especially when the decision makers are on deadlines and etc. aren't always in the room.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, and I've been both in-house and agency side, you want to build up that relationship with the folks on your team, and kind of, even something small as like taking them out to lunch and kind of growing those types of things. But you want them to kind of be aware of when things may have an SEO implication to them. Now, I've also been in scenarios in the past too where I need to justify the need or importance of doing something or correcting something, especially in the replatforming case. And I've been brought in those cases before where, hey, we're going live in 2 days. You want to just make sure this is not broken? Yeah, it's very broken. We're going to need to fix this. Obviously, you want to convey appropriate prioritization of things. So the biggest challenge I've always seen in working with developers is they go, oh, you SEOs just think everything is the highest priority item. It's a fair assumption. I've heard that before. But you want to be able to work with your developer and properly prioritize and estimate things to say, all right, guys, this is critical. If we do this, we're dead in the water. Like, hey, you've got a title tag that's unoptimized on one page. That's not a critical item. That's not something that you want to like risk your reputation on. But you want to be able to effectively call those things out so that way they understand an urgency around something and they understand, hey, we'd go live with this, we're going to run into a problem. But also leverage your data too. One big thing I've always done with clients in the past, I had a client once go to me, hey, we're going live with this redesign. We don't have time to make these pages. We're just going to delete them for the time being. And then, we'll bring them back in 3 months. Like, okay, interesting. Go back, look at the data, realize in the last 12 months, those pages have made you $30 million. Not just from organic, that's globally. Do you want to risk $30 million? Is the business in a state right now where you guys can just not have 30 million and call it a day? So you want to be able to leverage that data too to have those conversations and justify the value of doing something as best as you possibly can. There is a Battle Zone episode that Garrett and I did along with Mike that talks about the idea of SEO forecasting. And obviously it's not a perfect metric, but where possible, try and forecast out the implications of doing something. There is an element of really kind of calling out something and trying to say, hey, if we do this, we're going to lose X millions of dollars, or we're going to lose this percentage of traffic. This is going to impact the bottom line like this. The more you can kind of call those things out, the more you can kind of raise the alarm to begin with, especially earlier on in the conversation. When I went in-house, I had various conversations with my team to kind of say, hey, these are the types of things that will hurt us. And these are the types of things that we need to look at first. So if we start having conversations about doing something like this, just involve me in the call. I can listen, I can give you feedback, I can give you advice, and we can kind of talk about the potential implications that go on there.
So there you have it. Lots of really good ideas. And obviously I think that's such a good call out at the end there about like talking about the revenue, using the data, and then just being realistic with prioritizations. Like you're not going to die on every hill. You're picking your battles. And I feel like that highlights to the C-suite that you're not, yanking their chain of trying to get all your needs done, that it's really the critical stuff. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. You can find Zach and I both on Twitter and LinkedIn, or Garrett at iPullRank.com, Zach at iPullRank.com. Zach, where's the best way? Where would you prefer to be hit up on the socials?
LinkedIn or Twitter typically is where I spend most of my time.
There you go. Any last words before we send everyone on the rest of their good Thursday?
No, I mean, the biggest thing I want to call out is just make sure you're thinking about these things as you go through that process. Or if you're a marketer and you're not quite sure where to go from here, or you're thinking about doing one of these types of projects, make sure you talk with an SEO. That's where we can kind of help answer those questions and talk you through anything that might need to happen, or just make sure that you're at least kind of thinking in the right direction.
Yeah, and if you know anyone who is about to run a redesign or replatform and hasn't gotten an SEO, be that voice of reason. You get in front of them and say, "Stop! Let me help you out." Because
keep in mind, and it's not like you're not on the public stage here, right? So anyone can go see the performance data of a site through some third-party tools. There have been many news articles over time of like, oh, these guys really botched that migration, or these things just went really poorly, and then that starts to look bad. So you want to try and prevent those things and try and be as successful as you can.
There you go. On that note, thanks, Zach. This has been awesome. Once again, Garrett, we're with iPullRank, and keep your eyes peeled for that replay. And thanks for joining us. Peace.